Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving straight into this stack of research and articles you brought over, all about how tariffs are shaking things up in U.S. real estate and construction.
Yeah, it's quite a collection. And it really goes deep, Beyond just the headlines, we're looking at everything from, like, the price of 2x4s and steel beams,
Right.
all the way to how these big trade policy moves might actually change the interest rate on your next mortgage.
Okay, so our mission basically is to unpack all of this, find the key insights, the hidden costs maybe, and really give you a shortcut to understanding how this global trade stuff is hitting home, literally.
Exactly. We'll cover the direct impacts, the ripples through the wider market, and even pull out some strategies these sources suggest.
Good. So where do we start? The basics. What are tariffs exactly?
Right. Let's start there. The material's pretty clear. They're essentially taxes governments put on goods and services coming into the country.
So they make imported stuff more expensive.
Pretty much. Makes the foreign goods pricier compared to the ones made here.
And why do governments use them? The sources point to a couple of main drivers. One is protecting domestic industries, right? Make their products look cheaper by comparison.
Yeah, that's a big one. Help the home team compete. And the other reason often cited is, well, they're used as a bargaining chip, a tool in trade negotiations. Leverage.
Okay. And the current situation. The sources describe a landscape with definite shifts towards more protectionist policies in the U.S. recently.
We've seen tariffs applied to key things like steel, aluminum,
Mhm.
even tech goods, and it's often tangled up in ongoing talks with trading partners.
And understanding that backdrop is key because, as the research lays out, it directly hits costs, it affects how competitive industries are.
And it spills over into the whole economy, which inevitably circles right back around to real estate and construction. It's all connected.
That's the ripple effect you mentioned. These aren't just isolated taxes. They send waves out.
Exactly. Impacting property values in, well, direct and indirect ways.
Okay, so direct impact. That's got to be the cost of building stuff, right?
That's the most obvious one. Tariffs make materials more expensive. So building new houses, new offices, whatever, it costs more.
And then higher construction costs usually mean?
Higher prices for the finished product. New homes get pricier. And that can influence overall property values in an area. Simple supply and demand, partly.
But then there are the indirect effects, like the wider economic stuff.
Yeah. Think about retaliatory tariffs. If the U.S. puts tariffs on goods, other countries might hit back with tariffs on U.S. exports.
Okay.
That hurts American industries that sell a lot overseas. Could lead to job losses, people feeling less certain about the economy.
And less confident consumers maybe aren't rushing out to buy houses.
Exactly. It dampens demand, which again loops back to property values.
This isn't exactly new territory, is it? I think the material mentions some history.
Right. It brought up the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in 1930. Some sources link it to making the Great Depression even worse. And property values tanked then, too. And more recently, the concerns around steel and aluminum tariffs kind of echo that. Worries about less housing getting built and prices going up. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, as they say.
Okay, let's really dig into that first big hit. Rising construction material costs. This is where it feels most immediate.
Absolutely. The sources are very direct about this. Tariffs are pushing up the price tags on essential stuff. Right. Steel, aluminum, lumber, key ingredients.
Take steel and aluminum. I mean, they're everywhere in building,
Yeah.
right? Framing, components.
Foundational. And those tariffs, was it 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum?
Yeah.
They add significant costs for builders. One source mentioned the American Institute of Steel Construction,
Yeah.
saying these higher costs make it really tough for their members to price projects competitively.
And it's not just the metals. Lumber prices, too, right? That's been a roller coaster.
Huge volatility. And according to these sources, some of that is tied directly to tariffs on Canadian lumber. Canada is a massive supplier for the U.S. market, so tariffs there really matter.
And that kind of price swing must be a nightmare for builders trying to budget.
Oh yeah, a real headache. Makes forecasting costs incredibly difficult. It eats into their profit margins. Unless,
Unless they pass it on.
which seems to be happening. There's a case study in one article looking at new home costs. It found the average cost to build a single-family home jumped. I think it was 15% over just 2 years.
15%. Wow.
And tariffs were called out as a major reason.
Do they break down the specific material costs?
They did. It was pretty stark. Estimated steel costs for a typical home, up 20%. Went from maybe $10,000 to $12,000.
Okay.
Lumber, up 15%. It's like $15,000 going to over $17,000. Aluminum, also up 20%, maybe $5,000 to $6,000.
They're not trivial amounts. Adds up fast.
Definitely not. And that translates directly into a higher price for the home buyer, which you can imagine is a big deal for affordability.
Right. It's not just the materials, though. The research also connects tariffs to problems in the labor market, like shortages.
Yeah, that's another layer. The sources point out that the construction industry relies pretty heavily on immigrant labor. So if you have more restrictive immigration policies alongside these tariffs, it can really tighten the pool of available workers. Finding skilled labor gets harder.
Which leads to delays.
Delays, and also higher wages. Basic supply and demand again. Fewer workers means contractors have to pay more to attract and keep them.
Wage inflation. And that cost.
Usually gets passed along too, built into the final price of the home or the project.
Interesting point in the sources, too, about how tariffs might change what kind of labor is needed.
Right. If builders switch materials to avoid a tariff, maybe use more engineered wood instead of traditional lumber, that might require workers with different skills. So it shifts demands within the workforce.
And the key takeaways seem to be that tariffs don't necessarily create these labor shortages from scratch.
No, the industry often struggles with that anyway. But the tariffs amplify the problem. They make existing shortages worse.
Gotcha. And this labor impact isn't the same everywhere, right? It varies regionally.
Definitely. Depends on how much building is happening locally, immigration patterns in that specific area. It's not a uniform picture across the country.
Okay, so we've got more expensive materials, tighter labor markets. How does this translate into actually getting projects built, the housing supply?
Well, this is where you see projects getting delayed or even shelved. When costs are unpredictable and labor is scarce, a project that looked good on paper might suddenly seem too risky or just not profitable anymore.
So developers might get hesitant, pause things.
Exactly. More caution, leading to delays, sometimes outright cancellations, and the net result, fewer new housing units hitting the market.
Which is tough, especially in places that already don't have enough housing.
It just makes existing shortages worse. And it particularly hits affordable housing efforts hard because rising construction costs directly bump up the price tag for building those affordable units. It makes it much more challenging for cities, nonprofits, developers to meet their affordable housing goals. The math just gets harder.
And then there's just the basic logistics, getting the stuff you need, supply chains.
Right. Tariffs don't just raise prices. They could disrupt the flow of materials. Shortages pop up. Lead times, the wait time for getting critical things like steel beams or specific lumber types, can stretch out.
So delays again.
Yeah, and those kinds of delays can really throw a wrench into your project timeline. Whether you're building one house or a whole subdivision, it's a cascade effect.
One thing gets delayed, everything after it gets pushed back.
Exactly. And that has real financial costs. Maybe you're paying workers who are idle, renting equipment for longer than planned.
Could even face penalties for missing deadlines?
Potentially, depending on the contracts. The sources note these delay costs can really vary depending on the project size and complexity. A big infrastructure project might see different impacts than a residential build.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. How does this tariff situation ripple into the financial world, like interest rates, getting loans?
It definitely reaches there. One way is through inflation. Tariffs make imported goods more expensive, which can contribute to overall inflation.
And the Federal Reserve watches inflation like a hawk.
Right. If the Fed thinks tariffs are pushing inflation too high, they might raise interest rates to cool things down. Now, they look at a lot of factors, jobs, growth, global stuff, but tariffs are part of that mix.
So what does that mean for mortgage rates? Does trade tension make them go up or down? The material seemed a bit mixed on that.
It can be complicated. Sometimes uncertainty makes investors nervous, and they pile into safer assets like U.S. Treasury bonds.
Okay.
That demand can push bond yields down, and mortgage rates often follow those yields. So paradoxically, uncertainty could sometimes lead to lower mortgage rates, temporarily perhaps. But if the main story is inflation caused or worsened by tariffs, and the Fed reacts by hiking its rates, then yeah, mortgage rates are more likely to go up. It depends on which force wins out in the market sentiment.
The sources had a pretty powerful example of what a rate increase means for a homeowner, didn't they?
Yeah, really brings it home. They use a $300,000 mortgage, 30-year term, comparing a 4% rate versus a 5% rate.
Okay, what's the difference?
The monthly payment jumps from about $4,432 to roughly 54% dollars.
That's almost $180 more every single month.
Every month. And over the life of that 30-year loan, it adds up to over $64,000 extra in interest payments.
Wow. That's a huge hidden cost potentially tied back to these trade policies.
It really highlights the long-term impact.
Then what about for the construction companies themselves trying to finance these projects?
Major headaches there, too. That cost unpredictability we talked about makes budgeting incredibly tough, hard to estimate accurately up front, leads to budget overruns.
I remember a quote in there.
Yeah, something like, the key is to stay ahead by continuously monitoring market trends and adjusting your budget. You basically can't set it and forget it. Constant vigilance required.
And getting the actual loans, does that get harder?
It can. Lenders might see projects as riskier now because of that cost uncertainty, so they might demand stricter terms, maybe higher interest rates from the developers. The risk premium goes up.
So businesses need smart contract strategies, like those escalation clauses.
Exactly. Clauses that allow prices to adjust if material costs spike unexpectedly because of tariffs. It protects the builder's budget somewhat.
Or sharing the risk.
Yeah, finding ways to distribute that risk. Maybe the developer, the contractor, even the suppliers agree on how to handle potential cost increases, spreading it out.
It's crucial to remember, too, like you said earlier, this isn't hitting everywhere equally. The impact varies a lot by region.
Huge differences. Think about areas heavy in manufacturing. They might feel the pinch more directly from tariffs on raw materials like steel.
Versus places with more service-based economies.
Right, maybe less direct impact there. And coastal regions, which handle more international trade, might be more sensitive than inland areas that rely more on domestic supply chains.
Makes sense. Even down to state policies or differences between building in a dense city versus a rural area.
Yeah, all those factors play a role. Urban projects often have more complex supply chains, so maybe the impacts get amplified there. Where you are really matters.
Okay, so we've laid out a lot of challenges, costs, labor, delays, financing. But here's where the sources took an interesting turn, right? This pressure is actually forcing the industry to adapt, to innovate.
Yes, this is a really key takeaway. It's not all doom and gloom. These challenges are acting as a catalyst, pushing companies to get creative and find solutions.
Like what? What kind of adaptation are we seeing?
Well, a big one is material substitution. Companies are actively looking for materials not subject to tariffs or less affected by them.
So switching things out.
Exactly. Maybe using more aluminum or composites instead of steel in certain applications, or using engineered wood products instead of traditional lumber that might be facing tariffs. The sources even had tables showing these kinds of alternatives.
And technology.
Technology is playing a big role too. Things like modular construction, building sections of a building in a factory, off-site that can streamline the process and potentially use materials more efficiently.
Or even 3D printing.
Yeah, 3D printing in construction is getting a boost. It could potentially reduce reliance on some traditional tariff-affected materials. One expert called these techs revolutionizing the industry.
And what about making more stuff here? Domestic production.
That's happening too. Some companies are investing in building or expanding manufacturing plants in the U.S., specifically to avoid those import costs and the uncertainty that comes with them.
So it's like the tariffs, while painful, are forcing the industry to become potentially more resilient or efficient in the long run.
That's the argument. It's adapting, innovating, and finding new ways to operate, positioning itself for the future, even amidst the current challenges.
Okay, so given this whole complex picture, what practical advice did the sources offer for different people involved? Let's start with real estate investors.
For investors, a big theme was diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread investments across different types of property, residential, commercial, industrial.
And different locations, too,
Yeah.
right? Considering those regional differences we talked about.
Absolutely. And even diversifying how you invest, maybe some direct property ownership, some through REITs, or real estate crowdfunding. Spread the risk.
What about timing, buying and selling?
The advice was to really watch those trade policy announcements and economic signs. Knowing what might be coming, like a new tariff or maybe a trade deal, can help you decide, should I buy now before costs potentially jump? Or maybe wait if it looks like things might ease up.
Makes sense. And hedging, what does that mean for an investor?
It could mean a few things. Trying to lock in prices with suppliers if you're doing renovations. Choosing to invest in properties that use fewer tariff-sensitive materials, or exploring alternative materials yourself. Basically, finding ways to reduce your exposure to that cost volatility.
Okay, what about for regular home buyers, people just trying to buy a place to live?
For home buyers, the number one piece of advice is Budget for potential increases. Do your homework on what materials and labor cost right now in your area.
And add a buffer.
Yeah, factor in that costs could go up between when you start looking and when you actually close or build. Maybe you talk to a financial advisor to figure out a realistic buffer.
Negotiation is always key, but maybe even more so now.
Definitely. Understand the seller's position, know the local market conditions inside out, look at comparable sales. That knowledge gives you leverage.
And locking in your financing seems critical.
Super important. Keep a close eye on mortgage rate trends. If you find a good rate, consider locking it in sooner rather than later to protect yourself from potential future hikes. That 4%, 5% example really shows why. And explore all your mortgage options.
Now, for the construction businesses on the ground, what strategies can they use?
For them, it gets very practical. First, contracts. Really scrutinize those clauses. Try to include language that addresses how unexpected tariff-related cost increases will be handled. Negotiate for flexibility.
Inventory management must be tricky. Do you stockpile materials?
That's the million-dollar question. Stockpiling before a price hike sounds smart, but it ties up capital and you need space to store it. The alternative is just-in-time delivery.
Which relies on a predictable supply chain, which tariffs make less predictable.
Exactly. So it requires really robust planning either way.
Diversifying suppliers seems like a must.
Crucial. Don't rely on just one source, especially if it's international. Explore domestic suppliers. Look at suppliers in countries that maybe have better trade terms with the U.S.
And being willing to switch materials, even if it means changing plans.
Yeah, being flexible with material specifications. Can you use an alternative that meets code but isn't hit by tariffs? It might involve extra steps like testing or getting approvals, but it could save significant cost.
Okay, let's pull back one last time. What are the really big picture economic implications highlighted in the sources?
Well, we've touched on them, but housing affordability is a major one. Higher building costs mean pricier new homes and potentially higher rents, too. That puts a squeeze on families.
And infrastructure, big public projects.
They face challenges, too. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, etc. drive up the cost of building roads, bridges, schools. That can lead to delays or even cancellations of vital public works, which holds back economic development. One source specifically mentioned worries about budget blowouts on these kinds of projects.
And jobs in the construction sector itself.
If projects get delayed or canceled because they become too expensive, that can unfortunately lead to job losses for construction workers.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, it's clear tariffs have this really complex, far-reaching impact on real estate and construction.
Definitely. They increase costs for materials, they worsen labor issues, they cause delays, they can even affect your mortgage.
And the effects aren't the same everywhere. Location really matters.
Right. Significant regional differences.
But, and this is important, the pressure is also sparking change. Innovation in materials, technology, how companies source things.
The industry is adapting. It has to.
So the bottom line seems to be, stay informed. Whether you're buying, building, investing, or just living in your community, understanding how trade policy shifts can ripple through the market is vital.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a final thought, really. Considering all these interconnected effects, how might future trade policies continue to reshape, well, the very foundations of the places we live and work? And what does that mean for your neighborhood, for the future of homeownership and development where you are?
Yeah, a lot to keep thinking about. Definitely worth digging into the specifics for your own situation.